So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library. I'm Janie Herman. I am the manager of public programming here at the library, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our community room for what promises to be a fascinating, thought-provoking, and really a very timely conversation about science, society, skepticism, and how we navigate the space between fact and fringe. Really a most apt topic for the library, where we are really concerned about all things related to information and how it is disseminated. A few quick housekeeping items. This room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology. If you need hearing assistance, we do have headphones available for your use. So they're by the door. Just raise your hand and I'll be glad to run you a pair. We kindly ask that you silence those electronic devices during the talk, of course. We do have some questions already that were emailed to us by the community, to the moderators in advance, but we are going to also take some additional questions from the audience, and we will be doing a book signing after the event. So tonight's event is part of a valued Princeton University tradition known as the Pre-read, an initiative created by President Christopher Eisgruber to welcome each incoming class to the intellectual life of the university. Each year, a single book is selected for all first-year students to read over the summer, setting the stage for thoughtful dialogue and shared inquiry from day one across campus. This year's pre-read selection for the class of 2029 is On the Fringe, where Science Meets Pseudoscience by Professor Michael Gordin. The library would like to extend our sincere thanks to Princeton University for partnering with the library to make this event possible, and for generously providing free copies of On the Fringe to those attending tonight's program. Special thanks to the Office of Community and Regional Affairs for all of your assistance over the last few weeks. We hope you'll take a copy home if you haven't already, and that if the book will spark as much curiosity for you as it has for Princeton's incoming students. Right now, I would like to welcome Kristen Applegate to the podium, Assistant Vice President of Community and Regional Affairs at Princeton University. She'll say a few words and she'll introduce our esteemed speakers for the night.
Good evening. It is a delight to be here with you and to have the opportunity to welcome you to tonight's gathering with Dean Michael Gordin and Professor Corina Tarnita. I'll keep my remarks brief and so that you have ample time for what I know will be an engaging and informative discussion centered on Professor Gordin's book, On the Fringe, Where Science Meets Pseudoscience. We are grateful to Dean Gordin and Professor Tarnita, and especially the staff here at the Princeton Public Library, who all responded warmly and enthusiastically when my Associate Director, Melissa McCurrow, and I asked if we might extend the campus pre-read tradition to the community with this talk tonight. As Janie already mentioned, the pre-read, now in its 13th year, encourages incoming students to engage with complex ideas through shared discussion as they begin their journey at Princeton. Tonight's event is a wonderful extension of that spirit of inquiry and community. Michael Gordin is a historian of science whose work challenges and expands our understanding of how science, language, and ideology shape our world. He is the Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Princeton University, and since 2024 has served as the Dean of the College, the senior administrator responsible for Princeton's undergraduate academic program. In conversation this evening with Dean Gordin is Professor Corina Tarnita, Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University, whose interdisciplinary work bridges biology, mathematics, and complex systems. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gordin and Corina Tarnita.
Good evening. I am told the tradition is that I do a short reading from the book, so I'm going to do that. I am a historian, and I decided I would pick a passage that's actually about the past, because questions about this topic usually don't concentrate there. So I picked a short section of the book, and it's a short book in general, about mesmerism. The story of the mesmeric sensation sparked in Vienna, but really only caught fire in Paris. In February 1778, the Swabian physician Franz Anton Mesmer arrived at the capital of the Enlightenment from that of the Habsburg Empire, where his theories and therapies had generated considerable excitement. The boundary between medicine and physics is central here. On the one hand, Mesmer offered treatments that were supposed to palliate a number of maladies, both mental and physiological. On the other, he posited a naturalistic explanation for why his treatments succeeded. His patients often claimed recovery or at least improvement after sessions with him, and it is hard to gainsay the subjective testimony of an invalid about his or her own experience. Yet, the proposed mechanism of those cures enraged French savants, who took it upon themselves to debunk the interloper. Mesmer claimed to have discovered a superfine fluid that penetrated all bodies in the universe. When this fluid was blocked, sickness was the natural result. Fortunately, it was possible to control its flow through the human body and bring sufferers back to health. The fluid was magnetic, he said, and entered the body through various poles. The North Pole channeled mesmeric fluid from the stars through one's head. The South brought up terrestrial magnetism, which could be unblocked through massaging. The rush of the fluid could generate convulsions or trances, after which the patient reported feeling significantly better. Given the curative powers of this substance, it made sense to store it for easy release, and this was possible in a huge iron tub with rods sticking out of it. The whole business, and it was a lucrative one, became tremendously compelling among both elites and plebs. It was quite possibly the most popular subject of conversation of the decade until the convening of the Estates General in 1789. That mesmerism was sensational was not surprising. The 1780s in Ancien Regime Paris was a heady time, saturated with enthusiasm for amazing scientific findings, some imagined, some real. Shoes advertised to enable people to walk on water were fictional. On the one hand, but on the other, the Montgolfier brothers publicly demonstrated their hot air balloon in the summer of 1783, initiating human flight. For decades, traveling lecturers had displayed the wonders of static electricity, charging up small boys suspended by threads and showing how pieces of paper floated up to their bodies in defiance of gravity, or discharging a shock through a chain of individuals. The ability of the Leyden jar, which is a glass vessel studded with a metal rod, to store electricity made it possible to see electrical effects on an even larger scale, surpassed only by the invention of the voltaic battery in 1800. Mesmerism fit into this culture of spectacle and obviously drew on the daisy chain discharges and Leyden jar in its own iconography. Was mesmerism like the shoes or like the balloon? The natural philosophers of the day, shocked by the reports of risque behavior at Mesmer's salons and outraged by his speculations about a universal magnetic fluid that was undetectable by any of their instruments, aimed to resolve the question. Mesmer had asked the Royal Society of Medicine to verify his cures. It demurred, and although he was indeed invited to present before the Academy of Sciences, he was subsequently ignored by their luminaries. As he grew more popular, several academicians decided to investigate. In spring 1784, they impaneled two commissions, the more illustrious drawn from the ranks of the Academy of Sciences and the Faculty of Medicine. This was truly a star-studded crew, chaired by Benjamin Franklin, then visiting Paris on a diplomatic mission from the newly independent United States, and Antoine Lavoisier, discoverer of oxygen and the leading chemist of Europe. It was one of the earliest organizations of debunkers in the modern era, initiating a tradition in parapsychology that continues to the present. Mesmer's aide, Charles Dellon, agreed to be the main subject of the investigations over his master's protests. The commission began with the hypothesis that the magnetic fluid did not exist, and that all its subjective effects were the fruits of overactive imaginations. They set out to demonstrate this, factoring in contemporary theories of how the imagination varied by sex and social class. Lavoisier divided the experimental protocol into two parts. First, one would try to isolate the fluid from the imagination by mesmerizing subjects without their knowledge, and then one would isolate the imagination from the fluid by inducing people to believe they had been magnetized when they really had not been. The commission designed an experiment featuring a subject sitting in a chair before a screen, while Dellon attempted to mesmerize them from behind without her knowledge. And later, she was told that Dellon was there when he was not. The commissioners undertook a similar process with blindfolds. The results were as the commission had foreseen: no convulsions in the first instance, abundant ones in the second. This is the origin of the placebo sham, now a standard experimental design in psychology. The commission's published results discredited Mesmer in some circles. Others continued to believe in the doctrine, however, accusing the commission of bias and flawed methods, or decrying Delon as a poor magnetizer. Then the French Revolution swept Paris, and mesmerism was displaced from public consciousness. It found a new home across the English Channel in the 1820s. During the British revival of mesmerism, adepts used magnetic fluid to anesthetize subjects before surgery and combined magnetism with phrenology as a new conduit to understanding the brain. Once again, debunkers sallied forth, attacking those physicians who swore that, whatever its scandalous origins, animal magnetism was a plausible scientific phenomenon. And now I'm going to transition over here to have a conversation.
Okay, well, this is on, yes.
This is mine, I believe. You'll tell me if it's not, okay.
Yeah. This is really wonderful and at the same time unusual. Michael and I have been friends for, I don't know, 5-6 years. We've interacted, and I feel like he's, it's one of the easiest conversations that I've ever had. In fact, I think we're in the middle of the same conversation that started 5 or 6 years ago. We just pick up where we left off whenever we see each other. We've never had an audience like this, so it's a little bit, we have to adjust to that.
There might be some inside baseball. We'll try to keep it.
Yeah, we'll try to keep it to a minimum. And in order to do that, I'm not going to start with actually reacting to what you just read, but I'm going to try to start from the beginning. I'm very grateful to everybody who sent us questions. That's very helpful to know in advance. So you never know if you have enough time for all the questions, and it also helps structure the discussion. And everyone who did send questions sent great questions, so I really appreciate that. So I'm going to start, this was also triggered by one of the questions, but why don't you tell us why you wrote this book? When I say this, it's just, kind of how it all came together for you, but also why did you write about science as opposed to medicine, humanities? The question that I am referring to in particular wants to know, with truth being attacked and intentionally distorted in seemingly every aspect of our society, why focus on science where it has held up relatively well, possibly better than anywhere else? Or asked another way, why is this important when rampant untruthfulness in so many other branches of our lives cause so much damage? So start wherever you want, but give us a sense of...
I'm going to say 3 things, and answering that question will be the 3rd thing, but it might take a bit. So there's 2 answers to the question of why I wrote this book. The first is why this topic, and I've been interested in this topic since I was a kid. The way I usually describe this is I would go to the public library, and we're in one now. My public library was organized by the Dewey Decimal System, which if you go to the science section, and I was a science kid and I wanted to read about science, you would find all sorts of books. There were books about evolution, and there were books about geology, and there were books about UFOs. And I would read all the books. But I knew something was different about the UFO books. But I had a very hard time explaining why. They seemed very similar. They had the same kinds of questions. But it was clear that when it came up in school, the teachers were like, that's not what we do. So I was always interested in that question. And when I became a historian of science, I wanted to keep working on that question. And so I taught this subject many times to students as a way of introducing them to the history of science. And then, so the reason 1 about why I wrote this book is I've long been fascinated by this question. The second reason why I wrote this book is that I've, for a long time, loved the very short introduction series from Oxford University Press, those little books with the very boring covers of the stripes on it. If you go to Labyrinth, you'll see thousands of them. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a very short book on pseudoscience? And so I wrote them and said, would you like one? And they said, nobody wants to read about that. So I had to write a proposal explaining why it would be worth talking about. This was in 2018, I wrote that proposal, and I drafted the first version of the book in 2019. And then in 2020, everybody wanted to talk about this topic kind of constantly. But that's the reason why the book is so short. So the answer to many questions might be there was no room in the book. There's no room in the book because there's a cap of 35,000 words for all of those books. That's why they're very short. And I had to make hard choices. So that's where the book came from. Now, in answer to this question, I think there's again, there's two answers to that. So the first question is, has science held up better than other things? In one sense, yes.
I'm sorry, Michael, I don't, but if every answer comes in
yeah.
two answers or
Yeah.
three, I'm an evolutionary, you know, I'm a biologist.
Yeah.
We're gonna.
I'll be very quick.
Okay.
The first answer is, has science held up well? If many scientists are quite concerned about the prevalence of fraud, failures of peer review, and a replication crisis, especially in biomedicine and evolutionary biology. She's very right to caution me because we really can talk forever, both of us. So there is a sense in which many scientists are wondering whether the procedures they now use are adequate for the enormous expansion of scientific inquiry. More science has been done since 1970 than has been done in the history of the world combined. There's a lot. And the publications are increasing and increasing and increasing, and it's very hard to manage all that. So the second reason of why I study science, besides my being interested in it, is I think science is a simpler way to ask this question. Because the question of what's legitimate knowledge and what's illegitimate knowledge is the question scientists ask themselves all the time. So they ask and answer it really clearly. Mm-hmm. And so if I were to write this book about, say, a social science like economics or a field like theology, it would just be murkier because people don't address those questions quite as sharply. So I picked science not because I think science is in particular trouble, but because science is the simplest object to study this question in because everybody is participating in a discussion about it.
And in some sense, part of your argument is that it's not really that easy even with science because things get very blurry as you get farther and farther from a core that is agreed upon, right? And maybe that takes us to, you know, the second theme that I want to touch on is, well, who decides what is a pseudoscience, right? I mean, you were a kid going to the library, you read this book, it felt like it looked like the others, but it didn't feel quite right. And many of us, right, whether we're scientists or not, might have a feeling that, you know, we're interacting with something, it doesn't feel quite right. When do we know whether that's a pseudoscience or not? So obviously you're giving a historical perspective, but I think we're all also curious in general. So who decides what is a pseudoscience?
You do. I mean, literally, in that she's a practicing scientist, and the term is usually deployed by scientists to describe things that they feel are not adequate knowledge. I am not in the business, even though you might think I am, because I wrote this book, of deciding that X is a pseudoscience and Y is not. I actually think the category is, in terms of an analytic category, unhelpful. I don't think it picks out one thing. For the same reason that science doesn't pick out one thing. There are many different sciences with different methods, different questions, different approaches. And the things labeled pseudoscience are incredibly heterogeneous. I don't think there's one thing. But sometimes there are theories that are proposed or findings, and you and your colleagues will say, that's wrong.
About things that I know something about.
Yeah,
or I can't go to physics and say, you're doing pseudoscience here.
Right. You would say something about, you think that's biology, but that's incorrect.
Okay.
And then sometimes you say, that's not just incorrect, that's pseudoscience. That's an escalation of a rhetorical escalation. It's not clear to me whether it specifies something about the theory that's different. What it does specify is the attitude of the person towards that knowledge claim, saying that claim is somehow different from just being wrong. It's somehow dangerous. And so I think in terms of tracking, as a historian, I'm interested in when people want to use that term. When do they decide this theory isn't just wrong, this theory is pseudoscientific? And when you look at it that way, you see that there are certain moments when they throw the term around a lot and other moments when they throw it around less.
And so, okay, so that leads us to people thinking that they can demarcate science from pseudoscience, and that wasn't as successful as one might have hoped, you're going to argue. And then you are proposing this taxonomy of pseudoscience where you're proposing, you know, by basically taking this historical perspective, we can catalog them in types of pseudoscience. So help us a little bit to understand, you know, if demarcation didn't work, what is this way of creating this catalog, this taxonomy do for us? How is that helping us?
Okay, it's a great question. I would modify, this is not us going down a rabbit hole, I promise, but I wouldn't say demarcation doesn't work. I think systematic demarcation doesn't work. Okay. I think it's very hard to come up with a philosophically rigorous account that separates it. Demarcation happens every day, and you all do it every day. You get something in your inbox and you hit delete. You're like, nonsense, not reading that article. This is Uncle Leonard's doing it again. I'm gonna, like, everybody does this, and scientists do this all the time. You're going through a journal and you're like, well, I'm gonna read this one because, for a variety of reasons. So we all demarcate because there's too much to know, too little time, limited attention. We just can't do it rigorously. We can't decide in advance. The taxonomy, I think, is helpful because while there isn't one thing that I think is pseudoscience that we can pick out philosophically, there are certain characteristics that have been, that carve up the set of doctrines that have been labeled this over time. It's not comprehensive. There's many things that fall through the cracks, and some things can fit in several categories. But I characterize 4 different ones. One is vestigial sciences, which is most of them, which is a thing that used to be science and for some reason isn't anymore. Proven wrong, outdated, different methods. Astrology is a good example. Alchemy is another. Very many other ones started out as sciences and then became not. That's normal. Most science in the past is now considered wrong, overwhelming majority of it. Some of them are pseudosciences or labeled as such because people still believe them. There's another category about what happens when ideological politics gets involved. I call those hyper-politicized. There's a set of other ones which build conferences and journals and peer review and all the things a science has, but are somehow attacking the mainstream consensus. And then there's another category, which is, I think, one of the largest categories, which is beliefs that various powers of mind exist that are not canonical in psychology. And mesmerism is one of those, but there have been many others.
So I think for me it was very helpful to see it as these different categories. One thing that struck me as I was reading the book, and I don't know, maybe others, if you felt that way, is it's very interesting to see the dynamics of pseudoscience. So some pseudosciences disappear for some reason, like the French Revolution, for no reason that really has to do immediately with them, though there was also the debunking. They reappear somewhere else. Others disappear completely. Others stick around. You are talking, cold fusion is a really interesting example where it's kind of like exists there as a little bit of a fringe that's being sustained nonetheless. There are others that, and this is one of the questions that we had, there are others that move from being a pseudoscience. They make the other, they move in the other direction and they become the mainstream science, right? So do you have a sense, historically looking at this dynamics of pseudoscience, what makes the difference between those that die out for a while but then come back, those that, successfully, obviously, are not pseudoscience anymore. So tell us a little bit about, maybe lingering also on the question, which is, can you give a good example of one that came back?
These are great questions. I would, the answer is the unsatisfying historian answer, which is it depends on the case. And every case is different. However, sciences are the same. There are scientific theories that flourish for a while, and then all of a sudden everybody ignores them. They're like, you know what, not interesting anymore, and they go to something else. And then sometimes they come back. And that same phenomenon happens on the fringe. I'm going to say the fringe a lot. It's the term I use to describe theories that are on the edge of acceptable knowledge. That's basically to avoid using the P word, because I really don't want to be seen as categorizing one or the other. You can do that. I can't.
I don't, but
yeah,
sure.
But you could. Yeah, I would listen to it from you. Okay. So the dynamics often have to do with the same reasons that happen in science: popularity. Other things emerge, like there's a huge flourishing of them about electricity that happened around the time the battery is invented because electricity is available. And then different things happen and people are much more excited about a new thing. When space exploration becomes possible, you get a lot more things about space, whether those are in the form of aliens or whether they are in the form of whether in the form of aliens or in the form of there is no moon landing, etc. Like there's a whole bunch of those. Things move in and out of the fringe all the time. An example I use in the book is continental drift, which is now known as plate tectonics. When the idea is first proposed during World War I, it's widely considered to be ridiculous for good reasons, which is that the continents are softer than the ocean floor, so the continents can't move through the ocean floor. They would break apart. It took about another 30 years for people to come up with a good answer for how you could get the seafloor spreading, pushing the continents apart. And then it became a standard theory. That actually was developed by Harry Hess, who was here for many years. Another example is atomism. The idea that atoms, the world is made up of little tiny balls and void, is one of the oldest theories that we have, and it was rejected from the vast majority of human history as being completely ridiculous. It was always the theory that no one believed. And the fact that you all believe that this table is mostly empty space and a couple of charged particles is a crazy idea. But yet, I expect almost all of you believe it. So that's another one that came down. Acupuncture is one that's, I don't want to talk about medicine too much, but it's moved in and out over the last 300 years in terms of Western sensibilities of what's medical knowledge or not. That's rare. Usually when something's in the fringe, it stays there. But there are cases where it pops in or out. Things pop out all the time. Legitimate knowledge becomes vestigial.
Yeah, and so I think actually one of the questions that stayed with me most is less so about whether, you know, employing terms like pseudoscience, calling something pseudoscience is actually useful at all. I think we're on the same page there, we can revisit that. But the idea of the fringe, right? So the fringe is there. Things move in and out of the fringe. You make this really interesting argument that the fringe is like a shadow, right? It's inevitable, and in fact, it's probably desirable. But I think, you know, and I think a bunch of the questions had this sense of anxiety around everything that is happening these days and how much information we're all bombarded with and how to make sense of it all. Obviously, it feels that we should allow for heterodox ideas, right? The fringe, you're making an argument. I want to linger a little bit more on why you think it is useful, but I, as a scientist, feel like it's there and it's actually an important part of the process. You can't really do science, you can't really progress in science without kind of constantly testing the boundaries of your knowledge about science. Otherwise, you just pile on certainty on top of things that you already think you know, maybe until they break down. But at the same time, you have this feeling that too much of a fringe is chaos, right? So how does one, historically speaking, how does one navigate how much heterodoxy one tolerates in terms of an actual scientific endeavor, right? Is that different by field in your experience of having read about it?
Yeah, I call this in my mind the central dilemma of science. It's the key question of how you organize science. It's different by field and by time period, and in some cases by person, right? We can set the bar for what's acceptable knowledge or what we'll tolerate hearing about in science really high. So only things that are accepted today or very close to what's accepted today are up for discussion. If we do that, we will have no fringe or very little fringe. We will also have a very boring science that never changes. Or we can set it really low and say anything goes. People can talk about anything they want. That's going to be very hard, right? There's just going to be so much noise, it's hard to find signal. So the central dilemma is, where do you set it? How much weirdness do you tolerate? In theoretical cosmology, people tolerate a lot of very weird ideas. Mm-hmm. And in general, in quantum physics, people tolerate very, very speculative ideas with great effect. But there's been also a lot of weird things that they had to discard. In other fields, like epidemiology, I think, is one of these fields. Like, you really don't want to mess around too much. Mm-hmm. So it tolerates a smaller band of disagreement, but you have to allow some elements of non-orthodox thinking in if you want to have any advances. And that's the problem. Like, that's when do you hit delete or when do you actually read the email? Like, different people have different bars, but different fields have different tolerances.
Yeah, I very much agree. I also think that it probably also depends a lot on how precisely you carve out the question that you can that you want to answer, and how much that is something that you can experiment with. If you're trying to talk about cosmology, which is one of the broadest questions you can ask, or part of my research is in thinking about major evolutionary transitions. All of those have happened in a distant past that we don't have access to. So we're trying to see a puzzle of which we only have 5 or 6 pieces pieces, and there's, 1,000 of them, and we're trying to add a few more pieces here and there, just kind of guess what might have been, right? You constantly expect that you're wrong most of the time, and so you welcome a lot of ideas in the hope that you'll jiggle the pieces until you can make a picture that is, starts to look more and more like something that is at least coherent, right?
Yeah.
So I think it also depends a lot on what you're trying to measure, or what your field, what your discipline is.
Right, if you're saturated in evidence, you often tolerate less fringe because you have so much to talk about. Fields where you have very limited data, you have to use theoretical frameworks, and they tolerate more. That doesn't mean that their fringes are not problematic. They sometimes are very distracting, waste a lot of time, frustrate people, get called pseudoscience. But that also happens in the fields that are rich in data. But you definitely see different tolerances depending on the characteristics of the knowledge system.
So the question, and I guess maybe more broadly, I want to hear your thoughts succinctly about...
I'll be as brief as I can.
Well, because we've already been discussing it. But what is the fringe good for? And the question from the public that we got is, do fringe ideas have a time and place when they are helpful, like particularly helpful, I would imagine? And is there a danger of intellectuals dismissing these ideas too quickly? Are there downsides to writing off the fringe of society? I think, again, just to summarize, what do you think the fringe is good for, and in what ways do you see it as?
Well, it's good for questioning orthodox assumptions. By definition, that's what it is. It's the non-orthodox idea. And there are many times when you want to have that questioned. That's what it's good for, and that's what's bad about it, right? Because sometimes we're really settled on this question. We really think that this is how things are done, and you're opening it up again and wasting everybody's time. I think it's impossible by the nature of inquiry and the fact that we don't actually know what the final answer to nature is. There's always going to be a fringe. There's going to be what we think now, and there's going to be the edges. The fringe is useful in making us check whether we're in the right place. You can try and dismiss it all you want. You won't succeed because it's inevitable, but also you'll be impoverishing the capacity of your field to grow. And the trick is to figure out which ones are pernicious and which ones are helpful. And you can't figure that out in advance. There's no clean way of doing it. You have to entertain some of them at least a bit.
And so tell us a little bit, because my other favorite thing is about the debunking, right? And when debunking, like you were giving the example of mesmerism, right? The idea of coming up with placebo effect as basically a way to debunk, right? That's how it was invented. But there are also other good examples in your book. So tell us a little bit about, it seems like debunking can also be a very productive...
Debunking is many of the examples are in parapsychology, that is theories like ESP, psychokinesis. These are very prevalent theories. They're also tolerated more than a lot of the fringe. They often can happen in university contexts. They're often PhDs. There are journals. The Parapsychology Association is under the umbrella of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. But many of the innovations, like randomized control trials, are invented to explore and then debunk telepathy claims in the late 19th century. Many of the statistical measures of p-values, that is degrees of certainty, come from parapsychology experiments and parapsychology debunkers. So it's like a whetstone. The thing that you're measuring yourself against forces you to be more precise about your ideas. And the parapsychology community, for a very long time, still is engaged in dialogue with psychology, saying, you told us that this is how you do an experiment, so we've now designed the experiment to meet your expectations. What do you think now? And then they look at it, and sometimes they keep trying to debunk it. And sometimes they say it's a waste of time, we already know. And that second answer is disappointing, but it's understandable given that everybody has limited time, attention, and resources.
So pseudoscience versus the fringe.
So to my mind, they're identical in terms of, it's just that some people call some aspects of the fringe, some scientists usually call some aspects of the fringe pseudoscience. And other aspects of the fringe, they don't. They sometimes say it's wrong or it's too speculative. It's kind of going nuclear to call something pseudoscience, because you're not saying you are making an incorrect move in our game of chess. That's a bad move. You should take it back and we should play a different one. You're saying you're not playing chess. You're playing Chutes and Ladders, some totally separate game, and we are not in the same discussion. And doing that is not an invitation to conversation, it's an invitation to shut it down, often quite brutally shut it down. Whereas saying you're wrong is an invitation to open up a discussion. Even though it sometimes comes across as quite rude, it's at least an engagement. A lot of people on the fringe want more engagement from scientists, and a lot of scientists are like, I don't have that much to give you. So pseudoscience and the fringe, I think, are measures for me of, as an analyst, as a historian of science, different postures I can take towards the past where I don't prejudge the question. I enable the actors to decide and debate these issues themselves, which they often do with great vigor.
So on that, I want to stay a little bit on this topic. We all just went through a pandemic. A lot happened during that pandemic, most of it outside of the scope of this conversation. But I feel like we can't really talk about pseudoscience without having a conversation about the many times that the word pseudoscience was kind of thrown around during this pandemic. And so I want to read a very short paragraph from your book. Studies flooded the internet about the efficacy, or lack thereof, of masks, social distancing, refraining from face touching, quarantining one's mail, various speculative treatments, and so on. As these studies were publicized and then occasionally retracted, vestigial knowledge claims proliferated, occasionally garnering numerous adherents. Others reacted with hyperskeptical suspicion of all claims about COVID-19. Allegations of pseudoscience erupted. The fringing was happening between daily news cycles, an intrinsic consequence of the knowledge production process. I would say an intrinsic consequence of that knowledge production on a very fast scale in the public eye process. Yeah. But you know, I think the point is, can we stay a little bit with this paragraph? Not so much, there's so much to dissect there. But you are, if I understand correctly, making the argument, in principle, there's no real point in labeling something as pseudoscience unless you want to shut it down. We're not even going to engage with that. Otherwise, you're just saying you're wrong about this or you're wrong about that, and you engage with the heterodox views on the fringe. This was a very particular moment, a very unusual moment. This is not something where people have a lot of practice with dealing with such things. I just want to ask from a historical, you know, this kind of wisdom that we hope to get from history and historians, are there other historical moments when science basically was a key player in something on which people's lives on a great scale depended, and where it became hyper-politicized in the sense where you saw something like this, but maybe that ended differently, or any wisdom about that process? Is that a process that's inevitable? If we're going to run into another pandemic, should we expect the same? Something else at the scale of.
It could happen. So historians are terrible at predicting the future. So if you're going to ask me later, I'm not going to do it. That paragraph, by the way, was written in late April 2020. So it gives you I'm amazed the two paragraphs in COVID, which I wrote in April 2020, somehow still work. Which wow, that was my first fear when President Eisgruber said he's picking this book. I was like, I've got to reread the COVID paragraphs.
You were spot on. You predicted the future of that debate.
I was just trying to characterize the present. There have been incidents. COVID was a moment where we did not know much. Coronaviruses were not very well studied. We didn't have a great deal of knowledge about how they worked. We were in the middle of a really transformative change in how vaccines were made. That was also happening at the same time. I hope you all had a little flash of recognition with the quarantining of the mail, because I bet many of you forgot that we all did that. And I don't think people do that anymore. But in past incidents, there have been a lot of anxiety, and yet people have adjusted. So does anybody here remember the Cutter incident? This is when the polio vaccine first came out. There was a bad batch, and a bunch of people got sick from the polio vaccine. Polio, very scary, affected kids, not elderly, which is part of the dynamic difference between COVID and the polio epidemic. And there was a lot of work done to say, this is a bad batch. We figured out what was wrong. You should still get the vaccine. And that public relations campaign worked. And in fact, they figured out what was wrong and so on. But it could have gone the other way, right? It could have gone in a completely different direction, and people would have not trusted it.
But did you see any pseudoscience labeling? Were there fringe ideas about why they might have not worked that wasn't a bad, I don't know, was there some other kind of?
There certainly were conspiracy theories and other ways of thinking about it, but they didn't catch root. And there's a bunch of people who have provided explanations of why that didn't happen then and did happen now. Some would say social media, some would say the flood of information was bigger, some would say that the trust in government was higher in the 50s than it is now. Like, there's many possible explanations, and there's probably some truth to all of those. But there are always people who would say, oh no, it was a deliberate attempt to poison people and I'm not going to take it. But most people did take the polio vaccine after that. They thought, I trust the argument. So certain circumstances it does work, in other circumstances it doesn't. We talked about this a few days ago, and I had another example that was even better, and I don't know what happened to it.
Was it HIV?
Oh, that's right, HIV. It was HIV. That's another fabulous example. Everybody remember toilet seats? And you weren't supposed to, yeah, there was, those people above a certain age, I know there's some current undergraduates here for whom HIV is a treatable disease, that was not what it felt like in the 80s. But there was a lot of information. Does this virus cause AIDS? Very elevated conversation happening in scientific journals. Is HIV the virus? Does it actually cause this syndrome that we're all worried about? Can we treat it? Will there be a vaccine soon? Yes, we were told. There's still no vaccine. It turns out that the immune system is way more complicated than we thought it was, because by studying AIDS, we learned a great deal about how complicated it was. It's a very interesting virus, sadly. But there were all these fringe theories about what causes it, that it's not caused by a virus at all, it's caused by various lifestyles, that it's treatable, that it's not treatable, and all those things floated around, and in certain communities took root. And there's an example I do discuss in the book about South Africa, where certain of the conspiracy theories around HIV became government policy, and so some of the antiretrovirals were not accepted, which has a human cost if we think, as I do, but I'm not the expert in this, that antiretrovirals seem to work. So the AIDS is a case where it didn't end up, the fringe is still there. There's still a set of people who don't believe HIV causes AIDS and many other things, and some of them might be in this room, and there's like lots of people have lots of different views, but it's not as fractious as COVID was. And I don't have a very good explanation for why, but it's clear that you can see the phenomena are different.
Very interesting. We only have, I think, yes, thank you. We want to move to questions. I want to ask a question that was asked from so creationism, and we had a really interesting conversation about that too. Creationism as a pseudoscience was part of the conversation, it was part of the book. The question is this a phenomenon that has to do only with Christianity? Is this a phenomenon that expands to other major religions, right? Is there a tension? To what extent there is a tension between religious worldview and a scientific worldview in other? Where do you see other pseudosciences, basically?
Well, the original idea behind creation science, scientific creationism, is a particular interpretation of the book of Genesis that emerges from Seventh-day Adventism, which is not a mainstream sect, denomination within Christianity. But that's where it starts from, and was rejected by mainstream, like by Lutherans, Presbyterians, Catholics for a very long time. It has a distinctly American history of how it started, and now it has emulators in other world religions. But there's another example, and I think this is what you want me to talk about. In medieval Islam, so in the Islamic world is probably the epicenter of where science is happening in the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and earlier than that too. The general interpretation of the Quran is that it's true, no question. Not in the same way, though, that a fundamentalist would say that the Bible is true. The Quran is true, we are fallible. So if there's a thing the Quran says that we think that our scientific best science contradicts the Quran, it's because we're not interpreting the Quran correctly. So the science is right and the religion is right. And we use the science as a way of testing whether we're in fact reading this document correctly. And that was the dominant view for many hundreds of years. And that was also the dominant view of the Catholic Church for a very long period of time. Indeed, it's still officially the view of the Catholic Church. Despite Galileo, I can get into the weeds with Galileo if you want, we can discuss that, but that's basically, we interpret the Bible based on the best science we have. A more fundamentalist interpretation, that the common sense interpretation of the Bible is true and science needs to adjust to it, is a different attitude for how those two should relate to each other. And different religions have different ways of balancing. They're both making claims about the world. Some focus on the natural world, some focus on the metaphysical or ethical world, and some focus on both. And depending on where you fall on that spectrum, you'll end up with different conflicts and also different synergies with scientific claims.
And I think the reason I wanted to end on this before opening to questions is that one thing that I got from the book was, there isn't necessarily when you think about the dynamics of pseudosciences, there isn't a set outcome, right? It depends so much on the context. It depends so much on the interaction with the social and intellectual and so on context of the day where it ends up. So in some sense, I can see why historians can predict the future, but it's one of the things I appreciated about the taxonomy that allowed me to see that, look, it could look up, it could look from the outside as the same thing. Why isn't it ending up in the same place? But that teaches you something about the time, the culture, who was there at that particular moment, and so on and so forth. So I think that's very valuable.
I'm going to accept your endorsement of history as a form of inquiry. The context is everything. It's why historians are frustrating. They don't give you straight answers because really it is different every time. But that doesn't mean you can't learn something from the differences.
Agreed. So I'll open it up to questions, and there's a mic who's going to go around. I think the first question is right here. Lainey.
You spoke of astrology as a rejected science, but why would we even consider it to have been a science if there was no epistemological basis for it? It's just a story someone made up.
What causes the tides?
What causes the
tides?
Mostly the effect of the moon, but gravitational forces.
So you're saying that a celestial body has impacts on the Earth. That's the intuition behind astrology. Yeah. That we see that winter and summer have something to do with the sun, and the moon has something to do with the tides. Therefore, celestial bodies have impacts on the Earth. Why not Saturn, Mars? That's the intuition behind it. And there's also the fact that they have tons of data. And when you have tons and tons of data, the positions of all these planets, you can start mining that data and see what you can find out, and you find patterns. So the original intuition behind astrology is there seems to be some effect the heavens have on Earth. Let's see if we can use our amazing math to quantify that. And they did, and they found lots of patterns. And then eventually we're like, well, we actually get more data, and then we have a different theory of how the universe is structured, and then it makes less sense. But that's where the idea originally came out to be a science. It was the most prestigious, most mathematical, most data-rich science of the Renaissance. And then 150 years later, it was gone. So that's where the intuition comes from. But it's when I say this to students, they're often like, wait, the moon? And then they get really freaked out. But it's worth thinking about. A lot of these ideas, they come from somewhere, and then they extend it. But that's how science works too. You get an intuition from somewhere, you extend it, and hopefully it works.
Thank you. If you were going to go and sort of catalog all of the fringe discoveries that you've outlined in the book, and there's probably a lot that didn't make the cut, what percentage of them would have kind of emanated or come from real bona fide scientists? Mm-hmm. And what percentage do you think are just straight up grift?
So the grift question is a very serious one. I try really hard to focus on theories in which my judgment is that they were issued in good faith. Not every theory is issued in good faith, and this is part of the reason I exclude medicine, because medicine's got a lot of grift in it. So I think there's a small percentage that are about grift of the ones that I have been talking about or that I discuss in the book, but there's some that you're not quite sure. How many originated with bona fide scientists? Many. All the vestigial ones, right? Like all the ones that once were science and then faded out started with scientists and then got picked up and modified later in lots of different ways. And then there are many cases of, seances, like table rapping and so on. There are many eminent scientists in the 19th century who are super into that. And we believe the rest of their discoveries, but this we don't. And they thought, look, I'm just curious, I'm exploring nature, and I think this is just as credible as that thing. So there are many examples of that. An example I discuss in the book is Brian Josephson, who wins the Nobel Prize in Physics for a very interesting superconducting quantum phenomenon, is also very involved in transcendental meditation and thinks that that is scientifically demonstrable, and got into tremendous disputes, still does, about whether that's a legitimate kind of knowledge or not. And it varies. I mean, the same instinct to want to explore the unknown animates all the people I like to write about in this book. It's just that sometimes they end up being what we think is correct, and sometimes they end up not, and sometimes they're more stubborn. And sometimes they're less stubborn. And it's the stubborn and wrong that is the one that tends to get the pseudoscience label attached to it.
I loved your taxonomy, Professor. My question is about, one thing that struck me is that the scientific method has progressed over time, right? And it's mainly been in the direction of debunking a lot of the pseudosciences, right? What I'm wondering about is, did you come across any examples of the opposite, which is, did the scientific method actually evolve to bring some pseudosciences into sort of a real science category? And the reason I'm asking is there are so many medicine methods around the world, for example, Ayurveda, and you mentioned acupuncture, and we judge them to be pseudoscience because they are sort of not provable by the current scientific method, right? And so what I'm wondering is whether deliberately or accidentally, did some scientific method evolve any time to actually bring the pseudoscience into the mainstream?
Well, I would actually say acupuncture is a good example of exactly that. We were joking about this over dinner. It's like in the US, there is one way that you determine that something's a religion and not, and it's the Internal Revenue Service, which if it says that you're tax deductible, tax exempt, then you are a religion, and if it does not. And Scientology crossed that barrier in the late 80s. In the US, what you determine as a legitimate medicine and an illegitimate medicine is whether insurance covers it. And insurance covers acupuncture. And acupuncture is used for many things. You use it on racehorses. Racehorses don't know that it's discreditable or not discreditable. They just react to the needles, and it seems like it does something. Whether or not you believe in qi, something is going on, arguably, and it's really in the 70s that it starts to. There was a lot of interest in the 18th century. Benjamin Franklin was interested in this, reports coming of all this stuff. But when Nixon goes to China and there starts to be extensive People's Republic of China, US relations, a lot of scientists go and see that a lot of medicine, a lot of things are treated, including surgery, and analgesia is done through acupuncture, and it became investigated again and became much more reputable. So that's an example of things that had been considered, and in fact, considered and rejected, are brought back because of changing exposure, new data, and new willingness to test out the theory. Now, they could have tested out acupuncture and decided it was useless, and then we would have ended up where we were before, but that's not how that went. Insurance also covers a lot of stuff that other people don't necessarily think are real, but that is how we decide what medicine is in this country.
So it seems to me that, scientists or some subset of scientists are always going to be skeptical about a scientist that comes along and suggests a theory is wrong or a new theory is better. And I know your book, you had to limit it to the 100 pages or so, but there's one example that I was looking for and didn't see, and that is when, I guess back in '82 or so, Stanley Prusiner offered up a theory about how certain diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease managed to be transmitted, and yet didn't seem to follow any of the tenets of biology. Yeah. And he came up with the prion theory, for which he got the Nobel Prize 10 or 15 years later. He seemed to be pretty much alone in believing this, and yet he continued. Would you say that what he was doing, or at least what he was doing at the time, was considered by other scientists to be pseudoscience?
I wrote a paper on Prisoner when I was in college, before he got accepted again. I just was interested in this exact question. People thought he was wrong. You don't see the word pseudoscience used around prions. They're just like, I don't think this is right. I think we need more evidence. We need to figure out what's wrong. That's an instance of the community tolerating a fringe idea and allowing it to grow. Another example is the guy who won the Nobel Prize, the Australian, for showing that H. pylori causes ulcers, where no one believed that because it was obvious that stress causes ulcers. So he gave himself ulcers by drinking H. pylori and then cured himself, which is, wow, amazing. But in those cases, he also wasn't called a pseudoscientist. He was just like, we think you're wrong. And that's an example of a productive dialogue with the fringe. Whether or not Prusner ended up being right, and we now think he is, it was a way of saying, these ideas are interesting, and he's finding interesting phenomena, and we need, even if he's not right about this prion thing, we need to figure out why that data says what it says. And that is a way in which the fringe is very generative, because it produces totally new ways of thinking about things. So I love that example, because I just think the idea was so outside the box that you have a non-nucleic acid transmitter of information, so weird, and yet we now think he was right. And he was really persistent about it. So stubbornness sometimes helps, you know.
Are there questions? Oh, one back here. Let me run it.
Thank you. So, so like it's hard to imagine like for example, like the whole world was like vaccinated against smallpox. Like people could reach that kind of consensus about smallpox or as you said, like polio vaccines at that time. But right now, like people are so polarized about COVID. So, do you think like the world is at a stage like people are more suspective of science, or do you think it's just a normal? Do you like? And for example, there are so many, like in the past, things would be like be tested by media before they are published. But right now, like because there are so many influencers and they can say anything. Like the other day, I was here listening to the radio and they were saying like there are people saying, okay, if you put some kind of magnesium lotion on your, it'll cures your migraines. So because like are we at a stage where like there are more pseudoscience floating around because of political reasons or social media, or is it are we not? Are we? And then if we are, like, what can be done to change that?
It's a great question. I agonize over this question of whether, in fact, there's more now of the fringe than there used to be, and I actually don't know that there is. And let me explain why I'm not sure. It used to be that your Uncle Leonard had his theories about how gravity didn't exist, and he had green crayon, and he did his things in the attic, and then when he died, you just threw that out. Now, people just post it. Right, like, and so we see more. The barrier for publication has gone way down, but it's not clear that the enthusiasm to try and engage with nature in your own way is higher than it was. It's just that we now know more about it. Maybe in fact both things are true. We know more about it, and there's more of it. But it's very hard for me to come up with a rigorous way of measuring that. There are very few fringe sciences that we can study historically really thoroughly. One is creationism, because churches keep really good archives. And one is Immanuel Velikovsky's theory of cosmic catastrophism, because Princeton has his papers. Thank you, Princeton. But there are very few others. So there's that. The situation with the smallpox eradication, I think, says more about the structure of geopolitics at the time than it says about fringe theories or not. The first vaccine for polio was developed in the United States by Jonas Salk, but the one that really people use is a Soviet vaccine. And it was tested in the Soviet Union and developed, and there's a cooperation between the Soviets and the Americans to really promote, sorry, that's the polio vaccine, But the smallpox vaccine is based on the polio experiment where they did this. The smallpox vaccine becomes a collaborative thing where both sides are like, we can do this together. It's the 70s, the time of great cooperation and détente between the two. This is a thing we can do together that we agree is a good idea. And so the situation was ripe for that kind of collaboration. Those countries were powerful enough to promote that idea, and international institutions were able to distribute it. And also the nature of the of smallpox as a virus and its communicability is such that you're able to detect an outbreak and vaccinate around it and get the immunity. All those things conspired to make that possible. It's not clear with a different set of a different etiology for the virus, a different geopolitical situation, and a different kind of vaccine, whether you could get that kind of thing again. Not because of anything having to do with the fringe, but because the social structures that make that possible aren't the case. But the question about the fringe being larger or not is a really excellent one. I wish I knew the answer.
Can I also say, I think it's also a big difference between the ones that, the viruses that don't mutate a lot. So you can vaccinate once, like measles is like that, smallpox is like that, polio. You can vaccinate once and be done with it, as opposed to viruses for which you have to vaccinate every year, like COVID turned out to be, where, you know, that's going to be really difficult to sustain, even for people who in principle were very willing to do it the first time. And of course, if you also don't have a disease that is hugely debilitating for a large fraction of the population, then even more so there will be. So I think there are a lot of features that make this slightly different.
But and polio was on the path towards eradication, and then there were only really 2 pockets of it left, part of Africa and in Pakistan. And now polio is emerging in lots of other places because the social structures that were working towards eradication have become less effective.
In the mid-1970s, I guess it was, the advances in medical technology enabled more people who seem to have died to be revived. And this phenomenon and what's known now today as near-death experiences became more and more commonplace. It's my understanding that as they do studies on these, approximately 20% of the people who are revived are able to remember something that happened and are willing to talk about it. We don't know about the other 80%. So I just wondered, you know, you didn't mention that in your book at all. I wondered whether that's considered, you know, fringe science, or, you know, the thing about it is that it's getting bigger because it keeps on happening, and medical technology has continued to improve. And also, although a lot of these reports refer to something that happened that's otherworldly, there's a fair number that at least include a portion of something that they saw while they were supposedly dead, either happened in the operating room or maybe in a few rooms away. And later on, they could verify that what they saw did in fact, you know, had in fact happened. So I was just wondering whether.
So it's definitely a fringe field, but that, as you know, I don't think fringe is derogatory as a topic. It's basically in the family of things that go under parapsychology, along with out-of-body experiences and a couple of others, where there is rigorous and robust research programs that are not 100% mainstream. That is, some people think there's nothing there or not worth investigating, but it is certainly less fringy than Loch Ness Monster studies, in a sense. Like, there's more of it's done in university contexts and medical center contexts. So it's absolutely not orthodox, but it's also not, it's in this very gray area. I mean, the whole book argues that there's gray areas everywhere, but it's definitely in the gray area. Just as an anecdote related to this, it's almost exactly on this topic. William James, the great psychologist, brother of the author Henry James, was basically the founder of the American School of Pragmatist Psychology. He investigated spiritualism and mediums extensively, and mostly found not much going on in all of this parapsychological area, with one exception, which is people who have an idea or a memory of a loved one, and it turns out they died roughly around that moment, even continents away. And he's like, look, I don't know what that is, but we have so many studies, so many reports, many credible. We should investigate that because it sounds like something's going on there. Maybe there's nothing there, but it sounds too credible to not investigate. And it's very similar to the near-death one where we have data, we don't know what to do with it in our current framework, and we have to decide whether it's worth our time and resources to investigate that, or do we have other things that we think are more important to study? And different scientists make that calculation in different ways, and different funding agencies do too.
So what happened? What did William James find?
He didn't find out. He said, in my investigation, all this other stuff I'm putting aside, this one, I think we should look at more.
But he didn't.
Well, he did it for a bit, and then he died. You know, like it's a thing that happens.
So I think our time here is up. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you both. And, you know, again, thank you to the Office of Community and Regional Affairs for bringing the pre-read across Nassau Street and down into the community room here at the Public Library for the community to engage and for the books that they have provided so that everybody can be aware. And this, as I said, this conversation was fascinating. Now, if you're interested, we're working with Kristen's office on another event, which will be happening October 20th, and registration has opened up on our website. And this is when we're going to have Christopher Eisgruber, President Eisgruber, here at the library, who was going to discuss his new book, Terms of Respect: How Colleges Get Free Speech Right. So free speech on campus is a very much of a hot topic issue right now, and I think this is going to be a fantastic event. As I said, registration has just opened up on our website. If you want to get on that list, we suggest you do so. And again, Dean Gordin and Professor Tarnita, thank you so much for coming out today. And let's all give a warm round of applause, please.
Thank you all for coming. And